but there we are. We meet just a week after Premier Wen Jiabao returned from Pyongyang, where he marked the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and North Korea, leaving out a lot of the very, very contentious, hard and unpleasant history. That's what I suppose is necessary on occasions like this. But I think it bears note that, of course, China is the only major power that has any form of significant access to the top of the North Korean system. Kim Jong-il, of course, does meet with a variety of other visitors, but they are rarely senior politicians. One can safely assume that the Chinese visitors, perhaps 2 or 3 a year, will have an opportunity to meet with him. He is also the first very high-level Chinese visitor since President Wen Jiabao visited the North about 4 years ago at this point. There's a lot of water over the bridge in those intervening 4 years. A lot has changed. What has not changed, of course, is geography and circumstances and so forth. But I think it's important just to step back a bit and just look back a bit before we try to look ahead. When President Hu traveled to the North, it was the month after the signing of the September 2005 communique. We were in the early throes of all the controversies about BDA, but it was before, as best I can recall, the final meltdown of that process. But we were already on the road to nuclear test number 1. Even indeed, at that point, Hu had already, I believe, invested a great deal of his personal political capital in achieving some kind of an understanding, some kind of negotiated agreements about this. Hu, just again to take it back even farther, unlike his predecessor Jiang Zemin, Hu entered the Chinese presidency in November 2002, so it coincides very neatly with the breakdown of the agreed framework. And Hu made, whether driven by circumstances or by the strong advice that he got from Colin Powell, Powell made very, very clear that whatever was going to happen in Korea, it was not going to be a bilateral arrangement between the United States and North Korea. It had to be multilateral. And the Chinese really picked up the ball on that and made it, in effect, something that Hu took, if you will, some kind of political ownership of, which I think in part explains why there is such a strong and continuing commitment to a process by the Chinese, even in the face of a lot of disappointments. What else has changed since the time of Hu's visit? We have witnessed the end of North Korea's economic experiment, at least in declaratory terms. As we're all familiar, North Korea is now at least asserting that they are trying to re-centralize economic authority and economic decision-making on the North. The entire logic of the mobilization campaigns that have been underway since the spring of this year is very, very resonant with a classic kind of extensive growth model of economic development, even as at the lower informal level, there is an enormous amount of autonomous private economic activity underway in the North today. But at an official level, that's not the noises we're getting. We have the missile and nuclear tests since beginning, of course, in 2006, which then and now have triggered some very intense debate within China, certainly at an analytic level and to some extent, I would argue, among policymakers, about the costs and liabilities that China incurs with respect to its commitments to North Korea. Because, as we have seen in the intervening years, whatever China's unhappiness over North Korea's nuclear behavior, the increasing energy, economic, and food dependence that North Korea has on China has grown very, very appreciably. China and North Korea, or rather China accounts for about 70% of North Korea's two-way trade. A variety of other dependencies that are there for reasons that are well understood. What it hasn't led to, though, at least at an upper policy level, is comparable leverage or influence over North Korean behavior. In addition, just to note, I don't want to say this in passing, but the plummeting of Japan-North Korea relations over this period, and some very big peaks and valleys in inter-Korean relations. And of course, from the 2007-2008 period, a kind of a U.S.-North Korea-centered diplomacy. And now, of course, shifts under President Obama to the attention. In addition, we, of course, have seen Kim Jong-il's stroke and his seeming recovery, but all of this underscoring movement toward succession. Indeed, in some of the press coverage of Wen Jiabao's trip, there were, I won't call it allusions to the succession per se, but the idea of the passage from generation to generation. You could say that that was throwaway language of one kind or another, but it does seem to me that not unlike what the Chinese faced when, much to their unhappiness, Kim Il-sung that designated his son as his successor, thereby achieving the first communist dynasty in the world. There may not be a lot of alternatives but to go along with what may be evolving. But this begs the issue, and here Dick has raised the relevant point. China did undertake some new economic assistance agreements with the North. They're actually, from my understanding, quite modest in their scale and their numbers, but, again, any numbers of this sort are big in a North Korean context. One was very clear in all of his remarks to say, of course, all of this is totally in congruence with the spirit, and it is at the level, just the spirit of the UN Security Council Resolution 1874, which, of course, very explicitly states there is nothing in the sanctions that is intended to impede normal commerce, humanitarian aid, economic development, and the like. So they're within the ballpark here, but it's a somewhat elastic formula. What does Beijing know that we don't? We'd all like to know the answer to that question. We wonder, is there a different calculus here? And if there is a different calculus, do the Chinese feel that they are getting a sufficient return on investment, if you will, for what they are putting in? It's my general view that despite the debate in China, at a high official level, and this is at the level of Hu Jintao and Dai Jinhua, who are kind of the paired set who are responsible for China's policy, there doesn't seem to be persuasive evidence that the Chinese are yet prepared to revisit what I would call policy fundamentals. This is a very, very problematic issue for China for all kinds of obvious reasons. But as I said before, Hu has a lot of his own personal political capital invested in this. We don't know, therefore, whether or when China would begin to weigh significantly different alternatives in policy. Indeed, to look at one's behavior in Pyongyang, and more to the point, his comments when we returned to Beijing, and I would note for the audience, last night at home I saw the transcribed version of the trilateral press conference released by the Prime Minister, Japanese Prime Minister's office. It reads very differently, significantly differently, I would argue, than the remarks coming from through CCTV. There are a number of things. I mean, among other things, one, and I assume the Japanese have this text right, he makes it clear he's talking about his personally, not personally. So there's a sense of, it seems to me, of a difference that is worth noting here that is important. But one is in a way taking a script, not unlike the script that we faced a few years ago, and trying to reapply it, I think. That is an effort somehow to coax the United States back into direct contact, if not necessarily negotiations, with North Korea, in order to kind of keep a process going. even if it doesn't have a particular satisfactory outcome, but somehow, Churchill always talked about George always better than